Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am so happy to see you for our program today with Ariana Neumann. She wrote the incredible book When Time Stopped, and just a little bit about our author. I should just say, if you're new to Port Jewish Center, my name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson, and I'm the rabbi here at our little synagogue by the water. Our author, Ariana Neumann, is coming to us from London. So though it's 3 o'clock for us on the East Coast, it's 8 p.m. In London, our regular meeting time. Ms. Neumann was born and grew up in Venezuela. She has a BA in History and French Literature from Tufts University, an MA in Spanish and Latin American Literature from New York University, and another degree, which I'm not really sure what it is, a PJDIP in Psychology of Religion from the University of London. So incredibly well educated. She was previously involved in publishing, worked as a foreign correspondent for Venezuela's The Daily Journal, and her writing also appeared in the European. She currently lives in London with her husband, her 3 kids, and a bunch of pups. And I also want to say that in between everything that she did take some time off to raise her kids. And this book is her first foray back into the working world. And what an incredible foray it has been. I know a lot of us have read the book and found it to just be magnificent. And we are really looking forward to hearing from you, Ariana, and learning more about this incredible story. So I'm going to turn things over to you now and welcome Ariana Neumann. You just need to unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry. You would think I would know that by now. Thank you very much, Rabbi Mendelson. It's such an honor to be with all of you. Just now, let me just I have a little thing saying unmute yourself. It's a huge honor to speak to you today. It's a huge honor, to have you reading my book, or hopefully, in any case, listening to me today. And what is sort of funny about this whole thing, well, I have to, before I start with all this, I must tell you, I just had my second COVID shot. And if I start speaking in a different language or saying gibberish, please forgive me. It's a side effect of the vaccine. What is rather astonishing, I suppose, if you think that I'm just speaking to you today, is that if you had met me when I was 17 years old, I would have told you that I had absolutely no connection to the Holocaust or even to Judaism, actually, because I grew up in Venezuela, really far away from World War II. The Holocaust wasn't something that was mentioned at all. And I really just lived, quite a beautiful life in the sunny tropics. And it wasn't until I was 17 years old, when I got to a place called Tufts University, just outside of Boston, that a very dapper young man, Mexican, called Elliot, came up to me and said, "You're Jewish." And that was the first time anyone had ever said to me that I was Jewish. So it caught me a little by surprise. And actually, Elliot came up with the classic line, which was, "We should meet because we're both Latin American, we're both Jewish, and we're both good looking." And I took one look at Elliot and thought, okay, you're not good looking and I'm not Jewish, so I don't really think we need to meet. And we're really great friends now, and we have heated debates about what it is to be Jewish. And I'm going to start today then by doing something a bit strange, because most people hide their baby pictures, and I'm not only going to not hide my baby pictures, but I'm actually, sorry, forgive me, I'm actually going to show you my baby videos. And again, you might think that's a bit strange, especially as Rabbi Mendelson has just said that this is my foray into my new career. But this didn't start off as a career. It didn't start off as a book. It started off as a very personal journey of discovery. So I'm going to ask you to come with me to my childhood. I'm going to ask you to come with me to Venezuela. And I can't. There we go. And that is the garden in which I grew up. And that is my beautiful mother. And that is my wonderful dad. And the funny looking kid with the boy's haircut and the chubby arms is me. And as you can see from there, my father had me rather late in life. He was 50 by the time I came along. I was a child of a second marriage. And he had married someone called Mila before me, who was Czech, and she and my father had a young boy, and they had married in Prague. That was my brother Miguel, who was 23 by the time I came along. They had divorced. My father had married my mother, and it was basically just the three of us in this incredible house. My mother came from a Catholic family. My father didn't really speak about religion. So I was baptized and had a first communion, and we celebrated Christmas, as you can see by the funny looking Christmas tree. And I really had a pretty idyllic life. Ran around in that garden. My childhood was really blissful and luminous, and I was, the daughter of a very successful industrialist. And Venezuela back then was a place that was filled with potential. And all I really knew about my father as I was growing up, aside from the fact that obviously he was a successful industrialist who was very involved in all sorts of things, from arts to newspapers to education, he was that he had emigrated. He had been born in Prague in 1921, and he had emigrated in 1949 with his older brother Lothar. And I was sort of told that he had emigrated because he was escaping communism, and because he had been escaping really a broken Europe. But there was never any talk at all about what he had left behind in that broken Europe. Um, so when I was about that age, I decided that, as one does when you grow up in a beautiful house on your own, I had read a lot of books. I had read a lot of mystery books, a lot of Enid Blyton and Harriet the Spy, and I had decided that what I wanted to do more than anything was solve mysteries. So I set up a detective club, and little did I know that the biggest mystery I would solve would be that of my own dad. And it was one of those afternoons when I was hanging out with my fellow detectives that one of them reported that my father had moved a box. And he told a story about the box, and he made the box sound like there was some treasure or something really remarkable inside. So I waited for everybody to go, and I went and I found that box that my cousin had spoken of. And in that box, I found this. Now, he might look completely different to you, but I had no doubt that that was my father. He obviously didn't have the broken nose or the white hair or the wrinkles, but his eyes are really quite remarkable, and I just knew that that was him. The stamp of Hitler underneath him discombobulated me, because even then, and even as far away as Venezuela, I knew that he represented evil. It said Berlin 1943, and that made no sense because my father, of course, was from Prague. Why would he have been in Berlin? And then what really, really, really threw me was the fact that in the bit that it said name, it didn't say Hans Neumann, which was my father's name, but it said Jan Sebesta, which was a name that I had never heard before. So I think that was my first clue, really, that there was a lot more to my father, that there was a mystery there that he just simply couldn't share. And there were other clues. So when I was a little girl, he would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, and he'd be covered in sweat, having these horrible nightmares. And the screams were in a language that I didn't understand, and I now know to be Czech or German. And then again, there were other clues. My mother's family is a huge Venezuelan family, and by that I mean it wasn't just the three of us and my cousins. It was my second cousins and my third cousins and my fourth cousins 5 times removed that were part of our family. And there seemed to be so many photographs of all of them, and so many photographs of my mother and her side of the family. And my father had none, except for one. He had a very sad photograph of two old people. It was a black and white photograph. It was a very unusual photograph. And I find it so sad that I'm not even going to show it to you today. But it was these two people sitting around a table, not even looking at each other, not smiling, just looking down, really. And whenever I asked my father about the people in that photograph, his hands would start to shake. So all I knew was that they were his parents, and they were called Otto and Ella Neumann. And that was pretty much it. And I learned very quickly, really, that I should ask no questions, because whenever I asked questions, I would either be met with a wall of silence, or I would visibly upset him. And as a child, I think you learn that those are things that, well, you clearly don't want to upset your dad, especially as an only child. And then in 1997, I was traveling around Europe. I had already met Elliot, who had told me that I was clearly Jewish. We used to, in those days when you didn't have the internet, there was something called the Lonely Planet Guides. And the Lonely Planet Guide said, you have to go to the Pinka Synagogue. It's one of the highlights in Prague. It's absolutely beautiful. It's by the Jewish cemetery, and it's just been reopened. And the Pinka Synagogue had just been reopened. And what that meant was that its walls were covered with the names of the victims of the Nazis in Bohemia and Moravia, which is the area around Prague. And if you ever do go to Prague and you remember this story, just as you walk down the steps to the first hall, you walk down 3 steps. If you look to your right there on the 9th line down, actually in this photograph, I think it's the 6th line down, you will see my father's name. So Hannes Stanislav. Stanislav is a bit of a strange name for a Jew. And that is my father. And I was absolutely astonished to see his name. I didn't expect to see it there. I had been drawn to the wall as I walked in because the name Neumann was in there. And right above my father were, just a bit to the side, so I don't think you can see it there, were Otto and Ella. And I recognized the names as my grandparents. But of course, I had no idea when they were born. I had no idea when they were died. But my father, I knew, was born on the 9th of February, 1921, and that's what that said. And was really astonishing was that question mark, because every other name in that wall had a date of death. So I called my father up that night, and I said to him, listen, I went there, and the most astonishing thing happened. Your name is on the walls of the Pinka Synagogue, and it has your name and your date of birth, but it has a question mark. So they must think that you're dead. And my father chuckled, and he said, you see, I tricked them. I lived. Now, he wasn't able to tell me then how it is that he tricked them and how it is that he managed to live. But when he died, he left me a box. And it was that same box that I had found as a child detective with that same ID card, except this time it was just crammed with papers. And just remind me, because I might forget, I have the wall, not the wall, the wall's in Prague. I have the box here with me. And if you want me to show you any of the documents or anything, please ask me later and I'd be very happy to share them with you. So in 2001, my father dies and this box reappears, and it's, sort of the wrong time in my life to delve into the past. I was having kids. As a matter of fact, my father died 3 weeks before my oldest son was born, and I didn't feel it was the right time in my life to, just plunge into this darkness and solve this mystery of my father, because by then I knew, or I thought I knew, that it was going to be a very, very harrowing and dark journey. But with time, I got a little bolder. I started asking questions of my own family. So my uncle Lothar had 2 daughters who were about 25 when I was born, so slightly older than me, and they lived in Europe. But I started asking questions of them. And as I did so, all these other, letters and boxes started appearing. And this is some of the boxes actually, and this is one that came a little bit later on, which came from my cousin in California. So I started tracing people. I hired a researcher in Prague, and I found out that actually I had cousins in California, and I had cousins in France, and I had cousins in New Mexico. So, and obviously in Prague, cousins I had never heard of because my father had never spoken about them. And one of the most astonishing boxes that came my way came from my uncle Lotter's house. And it contained these beautiful letters, which were letters written by my grandparents. And I say they're beautiful. Perhaps the handwriting is not so beautiful as one of my grandfather's letters that you have in front of you, because they're unique in terms of historical records, or in that most people in the camp of Theresienstadt, where my grandparents were not allowed to write any more than 30 words. And my grandparents snuck these letters out, and their letters were filled with words. They were coded because you never knew who was going to read them, but they weren't censored. So they were really a window for me into their souls, into their thoughts, into their lives in Theresienstadt. So this is one of my grandfather's letters. This particular one was written on the 24th of December in 1943. And I just want you to look at it and see really how every bit of the page is pretty much filled. And you can see that it's very thin paper. You can see the writing on the other side as well. So it was with material like this, and by tracing people all over the world, I ended up having to find people in Singapore and in Australia, and obviously in the US as well, that I pieced together the remarkable story really of my father, but really of my family. So I now know that my father, who's this knobbly kneed boy with a funny beret hat on the left, was the son of Otto and Ella, who owned a paint factory called Montana in Prague. The man with the bowler hat is Uncle Richard, who seems to be in every single photograph of the family. I think he's a sort of token sort of bachelor uncle that just happens to, just emerge, always smiling in the pictures. He's in the middle of this one too. And that is a picture, of Otto and Ella, and the pudding boy, the taller one, the older one, is Uncle Lotter, and the one with the cheeky smile in the front is my father. And I had never seen any of these pictures before, and I again now know that they like to go hiking in the woods, and that this was near their beloved house in Lipcice. So this was the sort of family unit with Uncle Richard thrown in just for good measure. But there were 34 members of the family. 34. And as far as I knew, it was just my father and Uncle Lothar and Otto and Ella. So I had missed the other 30. And that was, of course, 34 at the beginning of the war. Now, by the time the Nazis came and invaded Prague, my Uncle Lothar was 21 years old, and he was going out. He had a girlfriend called Stenka. She wasn't Jewish, and she was absolutely a remarkable woman. She was bold, and she was studying law, and she was beautiful, and she was financially independent, and she was brave, which was really important because as the Nazis started to strip freedoms and property and everything from my family, she provided a lifeline. She took them food, she couriered messages, she gave them money whenever it is that they needed. So she really was sort of the glue that held the family together. And this was incredibly risky and incredibly brave because at the time, even giving a Jew a cigarette was prohibited by law. So you can imagine that ferrying medicine and couriering letters and sponsoring them was also a crime. And then in 1941, things got much worse for the family and the transports began. And in the first transport notice that arrived, it included at the house, it included my grandmother, my grandfather, and my father. Lothar was spared because by then he was married to Stenka. And for a little while, if a Jew was married to a Gentile, then they weren't deported. The family had heard that they should do whatever they could to avoid being deported. and they pulled every string that they could. They tried to prove that they had to stay behind, but they didn't succeed in getting my grandmother out. They got my grandfather and they got my father out of the transport list, but my grandmother was transported to Theresienstadt alone in May 1942. Another transport notice arrived in November 1942, and this time it included my father and my grandfather Otto. And again, they did whatever they could to try to keep both men out, because by then they had set up a system of contraband with Stenka's help so that they could ferry things into the camp to my grandmother, so that she could have a little bit of extra food, a little bit of something to keep her warm, a little bit of currency to bribe people. Um, and my grandfather felt very strongly that he would be more useful to her out of the camp than he would be inside. So they did whatever they could. And the day to come in and register at the train station came, and there was no way, obviously, none of the letters had worked. They both, my father and his father, checked into Bubny, which was the train station which was used to transport the Jews from Prague. And they had, I mean, it was, most people don't know this, but and most people, at least I include me in those most people before I did this research, thought that people were just ferried into these trains and deported immediately. But part of the dehumanizing process was actually to make these poor people who had already only 30 kilos with themselves spend days filling out forms and sleeping on the floor in the train station and handing out whatever belongings they had left and signing them off. So often this whole process took 2 days, and my father and his father were there. And at the very last minute, once they had done all these forms, the last thing that they would do would be to hand in a transport ticket. And the transport ticket would be taken by a Gestapo officer just as you boarded the train. And one of the things that my father left me in my box, and again, I can show it to you, it's absolutely minute and wisp thin, is this. And this was my father's transport ticket in November 1942. My grandfather was actually in Transport CC, and he was 448. And my father was saved at the very, very last minute. And instead of, throwing away this in relief and saying, I'm back, he kept it. And he kept it for me in the box. Now, in March 1943, my father's turn comes again. It's transport notice number 3. He can't get out. He knows he can't get out. He has friends that have told him there's absolutely nothing they can do, that he's going to have to go to Theresienstadt. And he knows he shouldn't do that. And he knows that because the letters from his parents say that he needs to avoid being transported at all costs. So with the help of the paint factory manager, who was a Gentile called Mr. Novak, even though the paint factory had been taken over by the Nazis, the paint factory manager was still in charge, and he liked the family, and he was a kind and bold and brave and man who did the right thing. He decided that he was going to hide my father. So with the help of Lotter and Stenka, they built a fake wall in this paint factory, and I'm super lucky that the paint factory still exists today. It's now a discotheque, which is unfortunate, but at least it's still there. And I can see the place where my father was hidden, and I've managed to trace Mr. Novak's daughters, one of whom was alive during the war. She was, I think, around 6 or 7, and actually still remembers the fights between her parents, because Mrs. Novak was absolutely terrified and angry at Mr. Novak for taking this risk and hiding a Jew. So anyway, so my father between March 1943 and May 1943 remains hidden in this tiny little cubicle in a working factory with 50 people going in and out every day to work. And he has to stay very, very still during the day. And Mr. Novak and Lotter and Stenka would come and make sure that he had food, and he would sneak through this little window very low-lying window where he would go out and have a little bit of freedom. And it's one of those nights where he has a little bit of freedom that his best friend Zdenek comes in. So my father, by then in 1943, was 22 years old, and his best friend from his college years, which actually in Prague is a little bit younger. So he went to technical school. He started at 16, and his best friend there had been a man, Gentile again, called Zdenek. Now, Zdenek and him had studied chemistry, and they were bonded by a love of pranks and jokes. They weren't very serious at all. My father actually was a prankster. He studied chemistry, as far as I can tell, so that he could build stink bombs to throw at the Nazis, and not because he had any desire to work in the paint factory like his family wanted him to. Anyways, Zdenek, like many men, had been sent over to somewhere else in the Reich to be part of the war effort, and he had been sent to Berlin to work in a paint factory. So he comes over to visit his best friend who's in hiding. He comes over, brings him a bottle of Slivovitz or some sort of alcoholic brew, and they joke around as two young men would. And Zdenek says, "Hans, if only you could come to Prague and help me, because actually we're so overworked, and you have all this paint knowledge from your family's factory." And there's a Czech saying that goes something like this, and I don't speak Czech, so if any of you do, please forgive me, but it says basically that the darkest shadow is just beneath the candle. So if you're going to hide anywhere, you don't hide in the periphery where the light is going to give you away. No, you do the counterintuitive thing. You go and hide in the darkest place in the center of it all. You do the only thing that will fool the Nazis, which is to go to the belly of the beast. And that's when my father decides that he's going to go and hide in Berlin. Sorry. Oh, no, sorry about that. That is not what was meant to happen. Let me just go back to PowerPoint. There we go. Sorry, I'm trying to get this to, there we go. So my father, in May 1943, with the help of Zdenek's passport actually, and his girlfriend Mila's ID that they've doctored, crosses over onto Berlin. He goes to the paint factory where Zdenek is working, bluffs his way onto a job, says to this man who is Zdenek's boss, he says, "Listen, I really should be picking potatoes. I'm just, a Czech person from Prague," obviously omits the fact that he's Jewish, says, "I should be picking potatoes in a field. I'm too clever to be picking potatoes in a field. So I'm here instead. I'm really good at chemistry. I worked in paint factories. I can help you. If you help me, I don't want to be in the field. I could be of use to you. Why don't you give me a job?" And rather astonishingly, Dr. Hogan, who's an ardent Nazi, gives him a job and helps him find a room. And that's how my father spends 2 years in the middle of the war as a Jew, really. Well, not as a Jew, as a Jew pretending to be a Gentile, living in the middle of the Nazi empire. So that is a photograph of my father, and that is actually a photograph that's in the official employee record of Warneke und Böhm. So he wasn't a forced labor, he was actually an employee. And that little pin on his lapel where the yellow star should have been is actually the company pin that all employees wore. And I find that picture astonishing because he looks very elegant and very serious, and obviously you have those eyes again. And I sort of feel that you can see how scared he is if you look close enough. Sorry, my system seems to have blocked. Let's see, there we go. Now, this is, if you take me aside, that's just to show you that the place is still there in Berlin today. But this picture on the left, the black and white picture, is my favorite picture. the man with the knobbly knees, the taller one on the left, the hair slicked back, is my father. To his left is Stenik, and that is one of the pictures that was in my box. And when I traced Stenik's granddaughter and son, actually they had it too, and it was a picture taken in the summer of 1943, and it is taken in the Tiergarten, which of course still exists today. I'm there in front of it in 2018, and it is the symbol of military might. Hitler loved it actually and moved it to the Tiergarten where it was, because it has Bismarck and it just exemplifies how strong the Nazis were. So I love it because you have these, 22-year-old Czech boys with their secrets as if they didn't have a care in the world fooling them, really. So it's it's my, I think it's my favorite picture for sure. Um, and then this is just a picture of me and my dad. And I think the book, if you haven't read it, is the story of my father's remarkable war, and and it's the story of his survival against all odds. But the book really runs on two levels, because on the one hand you have these thrilling moments, because as you may imagine, living in Berlin in 1943 was pretty crazy and pretty thrilling, I guess. There were bombs falling, and my father was was started passing off intelligence over to the Dutch resistance. So there's a lot of nail biting moments, I suppose. But to me, the book, well, it wasn't a book really. It was a very personal journey, and it was a journey to discover my beautiful grandparents that I had never met, and discover all the other members of my family, and to really discover the man that my father was before I met him, the man that he was before the war changed him so drastically. And it was just really a wonderful process of discovery and of getting to know my father. So that is to me what the book is about. And I was incredibly lucky to win the National Jewish Book Award for Best Memoir, and the ceremony was on Monday. And I'm not going to give you the speech because it was a minute and 30 seconds long, but I sat there, I went on and I just said, listen, I'm a fraud, because this book really, it's not a memoir. So I shouldn't be winning for this category. Actually, I shouldn't be winning at all, because the book it's not about me. It's a book of stories, and it's the stories of all my family. And it's, some of the stories of the 6 million people. And it's those stories that we tell to keep these people alive and to honor them. And then I just proceeded to list the 25 people of my own family that didn't make it out of the camps, um, because I realized that actually, that as I was doing the research, my family was so traumatized they couldn't talk about them. So I don't know how often their names were uttered and named. So, anyways, that's it. I'm going to stop there. If you're wondering why you have this strange cover, you have it actually because it's the British cover, and it's my favorite of all the covers. Every country, I'm really lucky that the book's been translated, I think, into 9 languages, being translated into Finnish and Chinese, which is sort of surreal, as well as Spanish and other stuff. But this is my favorite cover, and it's my favorite cover because it has watch pieces. And my father collected watches, and really, to me, this book is a homage, well, to my family who were in Prague, so you can see the building underneath. Um, but it's also a homage to him. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, um, and and chat to you instead. So I hope I give you a sense of what the book was about, and how incredible a journey it was for me, and how lucky I am to have been given this treasure trove of material, and to belong to this incredible group of people, that some of whom survived and some of whom sadly didn't, but who were all my ancestors and passed on all sorts of wonderful qualities.
Ariana, thank you so much for that talk. And I know for the pictures, which really put for those of us who have read the book already, to see those people on the screen and the slips, and is just incredibly powerful. And I want to give people the opportunity to ask any questions or to make comments. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Rochelle, do you have a question? You look eager. So I'm going to call on you first, Rochelle.
Thank you. I'm wondering how much of your father's story did your mother know? And did she live beyond your father's lifespan? Did you speak of any of this with her?
So she did. She's still around. She lives in New York City.
Oh,
I was I speak to her every day.
wow.
She was quite a bit younger than my father. So she was 29 when I came along. So she's still around. She's 80. I think she's 80. She doesn't
Oh,
really go around telling me her age, but so she is around, and she, I. It's funny because she's the opposite of me. So not she's not the opposite of me, but I'm fascinated by the past, and I need the past to tell me who I am now and who I want to be. She doesn't. She is one of those people that just focuses on the present and on the future, which is sort of great because I call her up, and instead of sort of talking about how wonderful thing life used to be, she's just focused on what she's doing today and what she's going to do tomorrow, and it's a very positive um, and very forward looking attitude. And I think that's what my father needed, right? Because my father was so traumatized that he wanted to cut his ties, I think, with his life before. So he married my mother, who didn't ask him too many questions. And I think he just shared what he could share with her, which wasn't very much. So my mother knew about 10% of everything that I've discovered. She knew the rough brush strokes. So she knew, for example, that he was um, that he came from a family that was Jewish. She didn't know how Jewish is what she told me. She said, I think maybe one of your grandparents wasn't Jewish. I'm not sure. Then she said, and I know he changed his name. So when I found that ID card, I ran to her and I said, we're living with an imposter. And I think that tells you perhaps what kind of relationship I had with my father, um, more than what kind of relationship I had with my mother. But and she immediately said no. He had a difficult war. He had to pretend to be someone else. So she knew that, but she generally didn't know how long he had been in Berlin, what he had done in Berlin. Um, his best friend Stenek, I now know, they continued to be friends until Stenek died in 1991. And my mother had no idea, which is rather astonishing because my mother and my father were together between 1968 and they divorced in 1988. So it was 20 years. So it's been quite a journey for her. And we've spoken a lot about it. We speak a lot about memory. And, memory is a fluid thing, right? She, having told me she had never heard of Stenek, having read the book, she says, no, I do. I think I have heard of Stenek. So it's sort of interesting, but it's been a huge journey for her. It's been at times difficult because I think, I don't know about you guys, but and whether you have kids and whether you share everything with them, but there are little bits of my life that I don't share with my children, perhaps because I don't want them to go and do these very risky, whatever, badly behaved things that I did. But there are certain bits of my life that I keep from my children. And I think as children, we look as our parents and we assume that we don't know the full story, we don't have the full picture. But when you have a equal, a relationship, a romantic relationship between two equals, you expect to know the secrets, right? You expect
mhm.
that there's a little bit more sharing going on. So I think it's been a difficult and wonderful journey for her. I think she too understands him much better. Um, but then, of course, she divorced him, so there's all sorts of conflicting feelings there. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question, Rochelle.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. Thank
Sure.
you. I can't wait to read it.
No, thank you. I hope you enjoy is the wrong word, but
No,
I
no,
hope you
it's
find it a good read.
wonderful. And I do volunteer at our Holocaust Museum here. And I'll make sure if they don't already know that they will know about your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Joyce Lansman.
I'm having a little technical problem here. Your story is absolutely fascinating. I haven't read the book yet, but my curiosity is, as a young child, you were raised as a Gentile.
Mhm.
When you found out the history from which you came, did that change you? Did that stun you? How did you approach this mystery that you opened up?
So it did change me. It has changed me completely. And yet at the same time, and I was talking to Rabbi Mendelssohn about this, I think I always knew. I think I grew up always feeling out of place. Um, and I don't think it's just because I'm pale and I don't look like my cousins. I generally felt like I didn't belong. I didn't belong in the Catholic school that I went to. I didn't belong with, I mean, I love my Venezuelan family. They're marvelous. But I just really didn't belong. I didn't belong. And all of a sudden, as I pieced all this together, it all made sense. It made sense why I didn't belong in this in this, you know, with this group of people, and in this life that was so beautiful, and that I was very lucky to live. So um on the one hand, it was wonderful because I just went, aha, that's what it is. I come from a completely different heritage, and I actually associate much more with my Jewish side than I mean, I don't associate. I love my Venezuelan family. I love Venezuela. I do not have any connection whatsoever to Catholicism, um, and I feel an intrinsic connection to my Jewish family. I feel to my Jewish heritage, um, and I'm incredibly honored and proud to be part of you know, of a people that are so resilient and so brilliant, frankly. So you know, I'm still exploring how I'm feeling. I was still discovering things as I was writing the book. So I think it's a very raw book, and a very and it's, you know, it's one of those things. I described it to someone the other day. They said, "How do you feel? How has it changed you?" And I said, you know, it's a bit like when you have children and you're at that process where you're looking at this baby and you just think, "Wow, I'm a parent." All of a sudden, your entire world has completely cataclysmically changed, and you have this little bundle of whatever it is, joy, I think, and you just don't quite know. You know it's changed you. You know you're never going to be the same, but it's really difficult to put it into words. And I'm still at that stage. I'm still looking at this thing, going, "Whoa!" You know, I'm half Jewish, or whatever it is, whatever, if you believe in halves. Or maybe my mother's not Jewish and that doesn't count, but I feel really, really attached to my heritage and attached to where I come from. And I feel a duty to tell the stories of those people um, that couldn't tell their stories, either because they were too traumatized or because they were silenced. So
You know, in actuality, you have been so blessed because you had such a strong early childhood that no matter what you've learned, it's based on stability. It's not based on sadness. It's not based on horror. It's not based on a lot of different things that can unnerve you as you go through your passage. So I really think you were very fortunate, and you still are, because you're unfolding it in a way that's not threatening. It's something that you're unfolding as a way of appreciation, of accepting those in your life who've meant so much to you. It doesn't matter, Jewish, non-Jewish, it doesn't matter. The value of the people you've known, and the it's just lovely. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. I can't tell you how your words mean to me, and you know, I hadn't seen it that way. I mean, I think the journey has been harrowing, but it has also been beautiful and full of light. I've learned so much about resilience from my grandmother and my grandfather. So all those things have made the journey much better. But you're absolutely right. Sorry, I have an echo. I don't know if it's me.
I fixed it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So it's, but I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're absolutely right. And, you know, often I sort of think, oh, I wish my father had shared this with me. And obviously it would have been a much better outcome if he had been less traumatized and he could have said, listen, this is where you come from. These are your grandparents. Um, but you know, life doesn't work out the way it should, right? And yet I was still able to piece it all together. And perhaps because I pieced it all together and my journey was the way it was, it has meant so much more to me. And it's actually allowed me to reconnect with my father. And actually, you know, maybe if I had been told stories about my grandparents, I would have never read their letters.
That's
And
it.
their letters are beautiful and so inspirational. So anyways, so you're right. It's been a wonderful journey.
Leslie Suture, did you unmute because you had a question? Roberta Cooperman, you have your hand raised, so I'll call on you next. And Leslie, send me a note in the chat if you wanted to ask a question. Roberta.
Yeah, one is a comment, I guess. Thank you for your story and for sharing it. I'm just curious, two things. One, I'm not through with the book yet. I'm more than halfway, but I did read in the book, and you did mention that your mom is in New York, which I was kind of surprised about. And there are a lot of Jewish people in New York. I'm just curious why she got to New York on one thing. And the other thing is what you just said, that you feel such an identification with the Jewish people and that you felt out of place, which you did say in your book, you felt out of place, which I find curious also because your mom is Christian, is Catholic, and did take you to church. And it's just interesting to me that you feel like, what I think I heard you correctly, you relate a little bit less to that side of the family than to this identity that you were never aware of. And living in England, I mean, my mom lived in England for 8 years and as an adult, but they're not typically, I mean, they're not the most I mean, the world doesn't love the Jews. So it's interesting to me that you want to identify a little bit with that part of your history and your culture. You're not running away from it. I mean, can you make any comments to that?
I can make lots of comments to that. So let me start with my mother in New York. My mother always loved New York. And I think as soon as I went to Tufts and she divorced my father, she said, I'm going to go and live in New York. She's, you know, I don't know. So she's always had this affinity to New York, and she married someone who's Jewish, who was actually has a very similar last name to my dad. So she went from Neumann to Hyman. So she's married to someone actually who's half Jewish, but he's Jewish enough, and his children are all Jewish, and so I have Jewish stepchildren. So I'm quite familiar with the processes, I think. And let's see, London. I hope that answers the question about my mother and why she ended up in New York City.
Yes.
And right,
yes.
New York City is very Jewish. I have always said to my husband, who's very British, that we're moving back to New York because actually, especially now that I've discovered that I'm actually quite Jewish, I'm going to feel much more at home there. London, Europe has a very strange relationship with Jewishness, and Jews in England are completely different than anywhere else in the world. I don't know if they anywhere else. I think let me rephrase that. The Jewish community in Australia that I've encountered is very, very strong and identify with their roots and are very proud. And it is the same in America. In England, it is anti-Semitism is really subtle and really endemic. And I don't know if I mean, I don't know why it is that you have a lot of people. I mean, I don't know why it is, but you have a lot of Jews here that are not proud of being Jewish. Not only are they not proud, but they hide it. So you meet people, and it's not until, 3, 4, 10, 20 years down the line that they actually say, oh, my grandfather was Jewish, or my father was Jewish, or my, and this book, for example, is a book because before it before it was a book. It was, I was telling the stories to people, and someone said it has to be a book. Have you ever written anything? And they put me in touch with a woman here who is one of the best agents in the planet. And I'm not just saying that because she's my agent, because she's actually way too good to be a first timer's agent. She's, the agent of someone called Mark Haddon and someone else called Madeline Miller. And she's, I don't know if you've ever watched a silly movie called The Diary of Bridget Jones, but she's that writer's agent. But she connected to my story because both her parents were Jewish. Her father was called, well, she's called Claire Alexander, and she is the daughter of Lord Alexander. So you can't get much more British than that, right? She grew up in Norfolk having cream teas and going to boarding school. Turns out her father was called Bela Kestenbaum and emigrated in 1938 from Prague. And it turns out her mother was one of the women in the Kinder transport. And they both became Lord and Lady Alexander and never spoke about their past. So my marvelous agent grew up without any stories. And when I said to her, surely you will want to investigate all this. Do you want me to help you? She said, no, because I don't feel I have my parents' permission to do so. But like her, as I've just started this journey, people tell me, oh, goodness, oh, my father, my grandfather, my great, we're Jewish, but they're all so assimilated. I mean, you do have a Jewish community and you do have obviously synagogues, but it's minute compared to the amount of people that don't tell you that they're Jewish. So it's a strange thing. And, we of course don't have JCCs here. You will have a synagogue and a congregation, but you don't have this pride in your roots that you have in America. And I think that is sad. Genuinely sad. And I just wanted also, just as an aside, to clarify that it's not that I don't connect to my Venezuelan family. I really connect to them and I love them. I just don't connect to Catholicism. I don't understand this conception of a God who's all good, because I don't know, because I think the world is a pretty horrible place at times, and I don't understand this whole concept of, you do horrendous things and then you go and say, I'm sorry to a priest, and then it's all okay. So the Jewish traditions of a God who is, both good and evil seems to ring a bit more true with me, at least. And again, atoning for things that you do wrong and trying to make right in this life is much more important to me than anything else. And traditions are, again, important, and stories are important. So I think that again resonates with me and Judaism. The Catholics, they don't believe really in telling you stories. They don't believe in reading the Bible. They believe in having a priest interpret everything for you. And I think that's different. You guys encourage, us guys hopefully encourage, discussion and erudition and seeking knowledge and truth and light. So anyway, sorry, I'm rabbiting on.
No, but it's so interesting, because I think, Ariana, that, I'm realizing as I'm listening to you talk, there are two, there's so much going on in this book and you share so much information, but there are two real, there are two hearts to the story in a sense, because on the one hand, it's the actual story and the details of what your dad and his family went through, and how, as I was, I listened to it, but as I was listening to it, I was thinking, how could this be, how are they able to, it's like there were so many incredible turns of good fortune in the fact that they had friends who were really willing to stand up for them, that Zdenka and Lota, got married, and that she didn't run away from him, but she stood by him. In so many ways, Zdenka is one of the true heroes of the story, that she she's able to go into Teresian, that she brings your grandmother food, and that, I mean, all of the, it's just, it's incredible when you know, that your father was able to get out, that he was able to live in plain sight, you know, in Berlin. Like, all of these details of the story are, it's riveting, it's page turning, it makes you want to just keep reading, keep listening, you know, however it is that you're taking in the story. It's really unbelievable, but it's true. And then the other piece of this, and I think, you know, for all of us, whether you're Jewish or whether you're not Jewish, you know, is the identity piece, you know, in terms of thinking about, you know, the question you said, so, you know, your friend or somebody asked, you know, how did this change you? And it's like, I think for all of us reading the story, we do want to know, and it turns to, you know, what does it mean? Like, how does it affect your, and you talked about this already, but I'm just saying that, you know, how does this affect your identity as it, like, walking through the world, knowing that there is this whole part of your story, you know, and it's interesting to hear you describe, you know, your mom just lives in the moment and you need the past to be able to kind of help define who you are at all. And I think so many of us want to know, you know, we're really dying for you to answer that question. Like, how did, you know, what does it mean for you now? Like, how do you feel about, you know, I would say, you know, as a Reform rabbi, you know, you would be warmly welcomed, you know, into the Jewish, you know, into this Jewish community, because as long as, you know, as long as that's where you want to be. And, you know, and I hope it's okay to say, we were speaking, you know, the other day, and you were saying that there was an Israeli reporter who said, you know, in Israel, you wouldn't be considered Jewish. But, you know, but that's really not true, you know, and shame on that reporter, you know, that you really are, you know, I think for those of us, for sure, I know for myself as a Jew listening to you tell the story, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's a profound story, you know, that that goes to identity. And I just, you know, I want to know more. I'm going to be thinking about that for myself. You know, what does it mean to have had this whole part of your, you know, your family story and to not know it? And I think so many of us want to know more about our parents and where we came from. And, you know, and I think what you do so incredibly well in this book is, I mean, to watch you, you know, to listen to you, to read you, you know, whatever, about how you discover, you know, like more, you know, the way that you, so I don't know whether it was systematic or whether it was just, you know, but you're able to collect so much information that you're able to find Zdenka's daughter, that you're, you know, that you're able to, I mean, all these amazing things that you're able to discover on this journey. It's really, for those of you who haven't read the book, I mean, Ariana has only, you know, has humbly only touched like the very tip of the iceberg in terms of how riveting the story is. And so for those of us who've read it, I want to, you know, I'm speaking about it in that, I'm speaking, I think, on behalf of all of us. I wanted to ask one question, and I want to be sensitive to the time and the fact that you're five hours ahead of us.
Don't worry about it.
But I'm curious, by the way, like, I think, you know, the heroes of the story really are all of the righteous Gentiles who saved your father's life, your uncle's life, who did so much to preserve your grandparents' life until the very end. You know, are they registered as righteous Gentiles in Israel? Have you submitted the book as testimony? You know, what is the status of that?
So you're absolutely right. And my family, you know, to me, the heroes are, as you say, the Gentiles, because they had a choice. And Stenka could have turned away and not married my uncle. Mr. Novak could have said, ooh, no way. I mean, my wife won't let me. Zdenek could have said, whoa, I can't give you my passport to cross into Berlin. What if I get caught? Then I'll get killed. And he was absolutely right. And he would have been, I think everybody would have understood. But I think, and again, I think this is about heroes and villains, right? And I think we have these conceptions of heroes, and we sort of think heroes go around in a cape and they, you know, win battles and they're always good, and villains are always horrendous. And if we realize actually that it's heroic little things, little actions, or that make us into heroes, and perhaps they make us into temporary heroes, we realize actually that's a more attainable thing, right? So we just think, well, we too can be heroes, right? Zdenek is a hero. And I don't know if he was a hero in 1946, but he was definitely a hero in 1943 when he gives his passport to my father to cross into Berlin. And the same goes with Mr. Novak. So I wish that as humans, really, we embraced being heroes, even if it was just for a little bit. And we thought a little bit, and again, we think evil, they're just like these Disney horrendous characters that are horrendous all the time and are dressed in, black. Turns out that no, we too can actually do villainous things. And actually a lot of Europe did villainous things by not doing anything at all and turning the other way. So the Gentiles are absolutely key to the story, because my family and my father did something crazy. I wouldn't say he did something courageous. He did something completely insane. And he was so lucky that it turned out to not be completely insane and foolish, but completely insane and brilliant, right? Because he survived. But, my family didn't really have a choice. So they just did whatever they could to save their own skin. But these other people are heroic. I have been in talks with the people in Israel, and we are trying we have started the process. The issue is that they tend to need, and they're very bureaucratic. So they need testimony from the person that survived. And of course, the person that survived is my father, or the person that they saved would be my father in the case of, and they can't be related. So we can't get, Stenka doesn't count because she was a member of the family, but Mr. Novak would count. And we're trying, and Stenik also would count. And we're trying to see if there's a way, I actually, I think, well, which I think if there's a will, there's a way. So it took me 6 years to find Stenka, but I found her, right? And I think I get that tenacity and sort of attention to detail from my grandfather. He was a bit of a petty man, and I think hopefully I don't have too much of that pettiness. But I think if there's a will, there's a way. So I'm hoping that we can get them recognized, because I think it's rather beautiful, and I think they should have a tree planted in Israel.
Could you just speak a little bit about the Dutch student? This is going to be the last question, by the way, unless somebody is desperate to ask another one. But this is good. Nancy, did you have your hand raised? Nancy Kaplan? Oh, okay.
So my father, when he arrives in Berlin, and he starts working in this factory. There were a bunch of people like Zdenek, actually, and that were forced laborers. And as a matter of fact, my father, when he goes in 1943, when Zdenek complains to him and says, "We're so overworked, I wish you could come and help us in Berlin," it's sort of horrendous, really, that the reason they're overworked is because all the Jewish forced laborers that had been working at Warneke and Bohm had just been deported to Auschwitz. So in this factory, which was a super important Nazi factory, super important. I mean, it was making lacquers for the V2 rockets and for the Luftwaffe. So it was part of the war effort. And then you had all sorts of, you had obviously the Nazis, and then you had people like Zdenek that were forced there. And then one of the other forced laborers was a Dutch student. And my father, in his writings, so one of the things, and I forgot to say this, is that he left me in the box, is even though my father couldn't talk about it, at some stage between 91 and 92, he wrote down about 26 pages of his time in Berlin, which is why I'm able to piece together his time in Berlin perhaps a little bit more fully, because I have his actual words. And then obviously I went to Berlin and made sure that the addresses that he gave me were right, and made sure that the documents were all, accurate and real. But the only story that I couldn't really verify was one of the Dutch student. And my father says that he's in the dining room and the dining hall one day, and that the student with a Dutch accent comes up to him and says, "Hans, I know you and I," or not Hans, sorry, obviously not Hans, "Jan, I know you and I are on the same side. Why don't we meet at 5 o'clock when we're heading home and have a chat. So they do that and they share a cigarette, and he effectively asks my father to pass off information to him and says he has some contacts, and that if my father, who had by then ingratiated himself with Dr. Hogan, and Dr. Hogan had given him access to quite a lot of important experiments that they were doing, my father starts passing off information for 2 years, which is sort of crazy, right? And again, I couldn't verify that. I did speak to a couple of people in MI6, well, in MI6, involved with MI6, and I had the good fortune of speaking to John le Carre before he died, and he's obviously the expert of these things, to just verify the story. And then very recently, I had a phone call from a Hungarian man who was a professor at Fletcher, actually, and I remember meeting him when I went to Tufts University, and who knew my father. And he called me up. He lives in Florida, and he called me up and said, "I know who the Dutch student is, and he's not Dutch, and he wasn't a student. He was a British undercover intelligence in Berlin." So so that's the story of the Dutch student. So sometimes I think I should, my next book should be about the Dutch student, but it's not going to be. It's going to be about 1940s and Jews in Austria and Vienna and England.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for this time, and for the gift of the work that you put into creating this beautiful story of your family. You are an incredible storyteller, and we are so grateful to you for everything that you've done to create When Time Stopped. I want to say to everyone before you go, two things. One, this has been recorded, and I will be sending you a recording. So if you'd like to send it to a friend who you think might be interested, and along with the recording will be the link, so that if you'd like to buy Ariana's book, if you haven't already, so that you can purchase this book. Of course, we would love for you to try to pick up the book at your local independent bookseller, like for here in Port Washington, our beloved The Dolphin. But I would otherwise, I would just encourage you to buy this book, and we'll share the link, and also any programs that we have coming up, and we do have a few. Finally, a week ago, we commemorated Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, and in Israel on Yom HaShoah, one of the things that they do is they blow a siren that can be heard all over Israel, and everyone stops what they're doing for a minute and stands in silence. And I thought that what would be appropriate in honor of the book, the work, the stories, the people, and of where we are in time, Jewish time at this moment, I just wanted to share with you a video of the siren from last week, and I hope you'll just take a moment. You don't have to stand. One of the things that I find so amazing, though, is when I was in Israel for Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron, which is today, Israeli Memorial Day, is that when the siren blows, no matter where you are, you can be sitting with friends in your house, and people will stop what they're doing. They will turn off the TV, and they will stand silently for the length of the siren. So I just thought, we've been so moved by your story, Ariana Neumann, and I thought, in honor of your family and of all of the 6 million, and that this is how we should end tonight's, for us today's incredible talk about your book. These are the highways of, I think, near Tel Aviv.
That was really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this incredible story with us. And all of us need to, of course, we are reminded there are so many more stories to be discovered and told. And you've done a remarkable job in telling the story of your family. And for sure, it is one that we will never forget. So thank you so much, Ariana Neumann. And friends, it's been so good to share this hour with our author and with all of you. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank
That's
you
the end
very
of the
much,
program.
Ariana. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.